Board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also with us, we have our Executive Director, Lois Bollenbach, and our Deputy Director, Edie McManamy. And we also have an esteemed panel with us, so that's important that we have questions for them after the discussion regarding this important topic. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan Stewart, a very capable staffer from SRTC, to be our moderator. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board and audience members and esteemed panelists. My name is Ryan Stewart. I'm a principal transportation planner with SRTC, for those who don't know me. And I'll be serving as the moderator today for our panel discussion on land use and transportation, linkages and important relationships in our decision-making between those. Just a few logistics before we get going. We do have some water and snacks in the back. Bathrooms are out in the hallway to the left, and the family went straight away. In case of an emergency, please exit out to the hallway, and there are exits to the right and to the left. Please mute your phones. Those of you on the webinar, we have you muted, but please feel free to use the chat function. For those of you here in the audience that have questions or comments, we do have some index cards available on the tables there if you'd like to write down some comments and questions. Today's event is primarily for our board members to ask questions and dialogue with our panelists. But if we do have time at the end, we have some questions, we'll try to address those, both the ones here in person and in the chat function for our webinar today. Again, I mentioned there are some materials to the side there. And we do have some flyers with the bios, information on our panelists. We'll go into depth on introductions today, again, in the interest of time. However, we will have all of this information, including the recording of this event, any questions or comments that are received, compiled in all the documentation for today's panel discussion. All of that information will be available on our website in a few days. And our website is srtc.org. Bear with me just a moment. Today's event is the seventh in a series, a discussion series that we've been hosting this year. The purpose of this discussion series is to inform the board and inform the public on transportation-related issues and on the importance of decision-making on those issues. Next month, we'll be hosting another panel discussion on transportation technology. So look forward to seeing more information on that soon. The purpose of the discussion series really is to, again, have dialogue between decision makers and the public and experts on some of these issues. We want to educate, we want to build a deeper understanding of some of these topics. Certainly, we're soliciting feedback from decision makers and the public on these topics. And that's all going to relate to identifying strategies. It's going to help the region make more informed decisions, advance projects, and prioritize those projects that we are advancing, really just to help the region be more successful in how we address some of the challenges and opportunities that we have here. Just real quickly, for those who are not familiar with SRTC, SRTC is a federally designated metropolitan planning organization, so we have responsibilities under federal requirements. SRTC is also a regional transportation planning organization under state requirements, primarily the Growth Management Act. We'll be talking about that quite a bit today. One of the responsibilities under the GMA is that SRTC is required to certify comprehensive plan updates and amendments and the transportation related elements of those items. We're also required to certify the consistency with the countywide planning policies. We might be addressing those as well today. So really that's SRTC's role in coordinating all those efforts here. I do want to just set a few things for context in our discussion today. Land use is a very general topic that we use quite a bit, but what does that really mean? Well, it means where we live, obviously, where we work, where we recreate, where we shop, where we go for education and other services like medical appointments, all things that are very important to our quality of life in our beautiful region. And when we talk about transportation today, we're talking about all those. We're not just talking about vehicular traffic. We're talking about how we get to and from those land uses that I mentioned before. Obviously, again, very integral to our quality of life, our everyday shopping errands, taking our kids to and from school, going to medical appointments. All of those are very important in the context of our discussion today. So today we have 5 esteemed panelists that I'll just briefly introduce. Again, we have flyers available on our website as well as here in person today with more information. But from my left to your right, I'll introduce Dave Anderson from Washington State Department of Commerce, Paul Otterstrom from Spokane Transit Authority, Lisa Key from the City of Liberty Lake, Jim Frank, founder of Greenstone, and lastly, we have Mike Ribner, Washington State Department of Transportation region, Eastern Region. So today's discussion, we have a few questions or topics, if you will, to discuss. But again, the primary purpose of today is interaction with the board members. So please feel free to chime in at any time. I want to hear your comments and questions for our panelists. And with that, I'll start off with the first one that's open to any of our panelists to answer. Very high level, general kind of question, but very important to, again, what we're talking about today. How do you feel land use decisions impact people's transportation choices? And what is society asking of us as planners and engineers and decision makers? There's certainly different perspectives on where people want to live and recreate and how they want to travel. So I'll open it up to anyone that wants to chime in on that. Start. Go ahead.
Because we work, on a daily basis in this area. If you look historically at zoning, going back, into the 50s and 60s and 70s, the whole intent of zoning really was to isolate uses. So that's why we ended up with industrial uses and office parks, districts, residential districts. The idea was that they needed to be separated from each other because we were concerned about how those different uses would conflict with each other. So we created this system of isolating uses at a very large scale, and then the only way you can go from one use to another was to run. There was just no option. So we've ended up with large, low-density residential districts. We've ended up with these large apartment building districts like you see along I-90 at Fort Road, for example. And we see office parks, industrial park or the Midway Technology Park in Delay. And I think we're now realizing, the drawbacks from all of that, that it destroys any ability to have walkability, it destroys any ability to drive anywhere. It destroys the ability really to create community, to create a neighborhood in which these uses can be integrated at a fine scale and are walkable within each other. And you have an opportunity to form a relationship with the local retailer, form a relationship with neighbors, and so forth. And so now we're trying to dig our way out of that. And the development regulations that we have been a huge impediment because they've not allowed those uses to mix. And so some jurisdictions have done a better job on this honesty than others have. In some cases, the Growth Management Act is helpful, but in other cases, it's had very, very negative unintended consequences. So if you look at if you look at Spokane, for example, the city of Spokane doesn't really have a development code that encourages mixed use. And yet they consume a huge amount of the development capacity under the growth management act. So they said they were going to consume X number of population, and then they couldn't accommodate it because they had no greenfield development plan, and they had very limited ability to do any infill development. And so that result of that is this enormous movement of housing development in Idaho. Because there's no room within the growth management boundary to do anything else. And so that's been a huge problem. Other jurisdictions like Clear Lake, for example, in Spokane County, have very forward-thinking development regulations that allow a wide range of uses. Like at Liberty Lake, we're doing streets that have little cottages, regular single-family houses, multi-family unit townhouses, retail, all on the same street, all within a few hundred feet of each other. And so it creates that opportunity to get biking and walking, accommodating a good portion of the trips that a family takes in the day. And when we do a mixed-use development with Kendall Yards and what we plan to read in Spokane County, we believe about 30% of the trips that a family takes in a day can be accommodated by something other than a car if the uses are in close proximity to each other. And that's pretty huge if you can actually achieve that. And we're seeing in Kendall Yards, because we've done enough there now, to be able to look at the traffic counts and compare them to what we estimated. And we're finding that 30% is about accurate. That you get about 30% of the trips that family normally takes not be taken by either bike or walking, and not necessarily driving. So that's a big factor. But there has to be a revolution really in the way we think about those.
Yeah, I would love to piggyback on what you guys said. When I was with David Evans Associates, I worked on a metropolitan transportation plan for Casella, in Idaho, and they were working on their comprehensive plan at the same time. And we took a really deep dive into looking at opportunities to create more mixed use, more neighborhood commercial, to better encourage other forms of transportation. And we involved the transit system in helping to look at routes associated with those different land use patterns. We had two scenarios. One was continuing as is down our current trend. And we ended up with a list of capital projects. We had probably over 15 billion in unfunded projects on the one hand. On the other hand, we looked at the scenario with more neighborhood commercial, more mixed use, more opportunities to live, work, play, and integrating transit better in that kind of integrated system. And we were able to get the illustrative projects, the unfunded projects list, down to one project. It was one interchange, and it was a biggie, but again, it made such a huge difference. Just looking at turning the concepts of Euclidean zoning, which is the separated land uses, on their ear and really looking at more integrated neighborhoods.
That's a great segue. Mike, we had a conversation a little while back about the financial implications of our decisions. And I know you have some thoughts you'd like to share on that.
Well, kind of piggybacking on what has been laid out already, there is a significant connection between how the land use is developed and whether or not it is affordable or efficient. And I think one of the things we contemplate a lot is how much can we do in the system? How does the system being utilized? Where is the capacity? Where are the safety concerns? Those types of conversations. What is being talked about in terms of creating this ability to use other modes is really an efficiency conversation to DOT. What it is bringing a cheaper, more effective and more efficient way to move people around in the system. And it provides us the ability to do more transportation options, more development, more growth, because the efficiency numbers are so high. And so we're, from a policy standpoint, trying to support this kind of conversation through things like complete streets, where what we're asking of our transportation system now is to develop all of these modes that have been left out for all of these years, develop those modes back into the system to create this efficiency. When you try to use the system, and if you think about all of the roadway network as a system, not whether DOT owns it or the county owns it or the city owns it, there's very specific uses that those individual roads supply to the public. And when we get really in trouble on the efficiency discussion is when we try to use those roads for what they're not intended for. So for example, if we apply interstate freight to a local street, that's typically not a good thing. That creates congestion and safety issues. If we bring local street trips to an interstate commerce route, we actually end up doing the same thing. We're putting those trips out on a system that creates congestion and safety issues. And they're always really expensive to solve when we approach it from that standpoint. So where I would like to support this conversation from the DOT's perspective is there's a lot of efficiency in this thinking. It creates the ability for organizations like DOT to spend the tax money in a much broader way to create more development, more economic development for the region. And it allows us to address more issues on the system.
Jim, you mentioned, oh, go ahead, Carl.
I just wanted to add on your earlier question of land use and its relationship to transportation choices is really every land use decision is ultimately a transportation decision. And whether it's market forces or government intervention, and I think the government intervention, just going off of what Jim said, is really important to recognize that intervention that the government brings in to say, we're concerned about traffic in this neighborhood, so we don't want to allow more growth, is usually creating far more congestion because that is pushing development elsewhere where it is less efficient and ultimately driving more people to drive rather than take more choices that could exist in an urban environment. And so as we recognize just that those decisions are just welded together like that, rather than seeing them as alternatives, it really is you make this decision to allow for that growth or prevent that growth in an area where it could be efficient. You are ultimately driving more traffic congestion and ultimately things you're trying to avoid are just going to grow elsewhere.
Just as a reminder, we need to speak up a little bit more. We have our webinar attendees are having a little bit of difficulty hearing everything that's said. So use your outside voice and they'll be projected back in the room. I had mentioned the Growth Management Act, and Jim, you certainly mentioned the pros and cons to that. Dave, I was wondering if you could talk about the GMA impact, Growth Management Act impact, our member agency's ability to address growth pressures. A good example is middle housing.
Mm-hmm. So if you look at how the Growth Management Act is structured, am I coming? How's the audio on the? Okay, great. If you look at how the Growth Management Act is structured, The fundamental requirements in the Growth Management Act are really all about creating feedback loops, okay? Rather than planning for, okay, we're gonna have the housing authority do a housing plan, and we're gonna have the transportation commission do a transportation plan, and then each local government is gonna do their own land use element. It's really about trying to integrate those plans together and making sure that those plans are talking to each other. So the decisions you're making about land use, you're having to ask questions about what kind of infrastructure is that going to generate a need for? What kind of transportation system actually supports the vision that our community came up with, okay? And how do we integrate these together? So if we can't afford it, we go to a direction that actually is affordable. That's the fundamental requirement period within the Growth Management Act. We can talk a lot about planning practice and level of service, currency, and how those are put together. They're not specified all that directly that you have to do it this particular way in the statute. The fundamental requirement is that you have this conversation about how these things are interacting with each other, and that you figure out how you're going to pay for it before you make that permanent zoning decision about what we can build here, rather than sort of the way we were doing it in the 80s and 70s and 60s, where you approved a zoning ordinance and then you tried to come back later and figure out, well, how are you going to pay for infrastructure? And so moving that up front ahead of the land use decision allows you to get more certainty at the permit counter, because you already know, okay, we know what we have to work with. We know how we're going to meet the demands associated with this particular development. I can go forward, and we're not going back to fundamental conversations about, is this the right place for development at the permit counter? You're not trying to do this subdivision by subdivision by subdivision. You take a regional approach to it. You do it at the beginning of the update process. And then once that's in place, it's good to go. Now, there's a lot of evolution we could talk to about planning practice and level of service, and how do you do a more sophisticated job of understanding what actually drives transportation demand, and how much parking do you really need, and is parking demand even something that really requires a public intervention or not? Those are good conversations to have, but the GMA itself at its fundamental level is about creating those feedback loops, okay? And that's a large part of the conversation we're having today. How do we develop a strategy on both the land use side and on the transportation side that are integrated?
Jim, you had mentioned earlier about some of the challenges that the development community is facing. I was wondering if you'd like to expand a little bit more. Dave's point was really well taken, and for example, we were looking at the former Kaiser property development and trying to analyze that in kind of that old paradigm of looking at trip generation. I don't want to get into engineer and planner speak here today, but I'd be interested to hear from you. What are the most critical transportation challenges that you as the developer are facing?
I mean, I think I think in theory, what Dave is saying about the Growth Management Act may be true, that it's intended to stimulate, these conversations. But in practice, it's not done that. It simply hasn't done it. And so what becomes important out of the Growth Management Act are the restrictions. And restrictions are things like the boundary, for example. And the boundary has real effect, has real consequences. And then there's no follow-up. So there's no looking at the development regulations, because the comp plan is aspirational. It's the aspiration of that city or jurisdiction about what they want the community to be and what they want it to look at and how they want it to be. So you can look at a comp plan like the City of Spokane comp plan, and it says centers and corridors. The whole nature of the comp plan is centers and corridors. All the words are there to say this is the kind of neighborhoods and community we want. We want our city to be built around these neighborhood centers and corridors where there'd be increased density around the corridors. But then no one ever bothered to see that the development regulations never followed. So you have a 20-year-old comp plan that says centers and corridors, and not one of them's ever been developed, not one. And so that's the problem, is that in theory, this is nice, these words are nice, but they don't work. You know, there's no real on the ground effect. And the real on the ground effect has been that we've encouraged sprawl. And we've forced more than 50% of our new housing construction into North Idaho. I mean, that's the on the ground effect of it. So we have to, and it's complicated. That's the really difficult part when I have conversations with people about this. There's so many details in a development regulation. What's the lot frontage requirement? Are you required to have the lot face a public street? What's the site coverage? What are the setback requirements? It's complicated, and most people don't understand all the nuance that's involved in having an effective development regulations. And so it's hard to explain to people sometimes. And even Lisa, I'm sure, has this problem with her council and with her mayor and staff, that it's a lot of complicated details that all have to come together. But at the end of the day, we have to allow, there's a bigger picture here. And I don't know so much that it's about communicating the cost of things, because I think we know what kind of communities we want. And I also think that people know what kind of communities they want to live in. People don't want to live in dense apartment projects like what you see happening along I-90 at Florida. People do not want to live there. They live there because they have to live there. They live there because that's the only place where the houses are. Not that many people want to live in isolated subdivisions, but that's where the houses are. But I can tell you, just from our own experience, that people want to live in a neighborhood that has integrated uses in it. They want to live in a neighborhood where they can walk to a restaurant or walk to a grocery store. They want to live in a neighborhood where they know their neighbors and their neighbors know them. They want to live in a neighborhood that has good walking trails and parks nearby. That's what people want. And in the changing environment around work and how people are working today, more people are working from home. The one thing we know about the effects of COVID are that more people are going to spend more time in their houses. And what percent are going to go back to work and not go back to work and all that is still evolving, but people are going to spend more time in their neighborhood. And so their neighborhood is much more important than it was before COVID. Because when you live in your neighborhood, these services are much more important to you. And we know what these things are, and we know what we want to do. We have to allow it. And I have a very simple, people ask me, why do developers do these things? Developers do exactly what your development code allows them to do. And so when you see a big, massive 1,000 apartment units all in one place, and you ask, why do developers do that? They do it because you told them to do it. You told them that's how you wanted the development to happen. That's how. So if you want something different, you have to allow it. If you don't allow it, it's not going to happen.
That's, thank you. And it's not just new development we're talking about here too. I mean, there's, I like to phrase there's opportunities out there. Lisa, I mean, I think redevelopment is something that we need to think about in our decision-making processes as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is more challenging, it's easier in a greenfield community, and frankly, Liberty Lakes greenfield community. it's, it's much more challenging when we're looking at a redevelopment scenario. It's actually more costly. Sometimes it's easier to do greenfield development, even with the new infrastructure that's required, than to try and work within the existing bones. And that's maybe one of the shortcomings of growth management, is that it assumes that you're going to do redevelopment, but the infrastructure in that area, in that urban environment, may not be adequate to handle an increased density. The sewer pipes may not be adequate. They may be old, may need to be replaced. The transportation network, the streets are narrow and may not be conducive to transit or other types of opportunities. So while I think that evolution in the older parts of our community has to happen, it's very, very challenging. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of disparate ownership, which makes it even more challenging to try and densify. So, so those are challenges. And again, I think that it's one of the things that one of the shortcomings of Growth Management Act, or maybe it's just the analyses that we do in support of Growth Management Act, is that we don't recognize that it's not that simple to create density in an already developed area. So,
Carla, I ask you, I know that we are talking about challenges or opportunities. I'm an eternal optimist here. There are examples of success stories in our community, and there's lots of other opportunities. How do you see those opportunities as a service provider in supporting not only the traveling public, but our jurisdictions?
Well, going back to the City of Spokane's comprehensive plan, that aspirational aspects of it, while there are a lot of limitations or flaws given the zoning code, that is something, honestly, that attracted me back to Spokane, was seeing that there is an emphasis on centers and corridors, at least in concept. And I'd say in the last 5, 6, 7 years, you've seen more of the infrastructure investments support that, so that there are upgraded streets, Sprague Avenue being one of them, and North Monroe, that support those transportation choices. So, as we look forward to further in the future, I'm hopeful that we'll see the development codes allow for the destiny of those areas to actually to flourish and embrace the infrastructure that's there and whatnot. I think also, there's highlights outside the City of Spokane. One that I think surprises people sometimes that I think about is exit 272 at Medical Lake. From a transportation choices standpoint, and integration of modes and capacity, that area was within the urban growth area. And so it was an area that, as collectively we said we want growth there as a region, but STA didn't have any transit. And yet there was transit on the freeway going 60 miles an hour without any connection. And so really, while that area had been developing over several decades, being able to say, how can we take that, if you think about that high transmission line of transit and bring that into downgrade that to a substation, if you will, from an analogy standpoint, so that we can tap into that local area. Our project and dovetailing with the improvements that WashDOT was making it interchange, and then bringing that all together with investments concurrent with the Amazon that chose to be, they wanted to be by transit, and lo and behold, this was an area that we were making transit accessible. And I think all those things coming together, it's not so much, hey, this is, I think a lot of people over time would talk about South Perry neighborhood. It's great, there's some great pubs, but there's not the density there. There's not the access that really drives the economic value. And so obviously, so the West Plains, I'd say, is one. I think the U District is an area that has been for a long time fostered and developed and embraced, not just at the local level, but statewide, as an investment in increasing job access, education access, and transit access. And of course, the city line will be through there. And I'm really pleased the City of Spokane really, just in the last couple of years, has embraced the idea of we are going to invest in upgrading zoning in a real way. And they are currently working on a master SEPA permit for the area next to Gonzaga to allow for, increased development within walking distance of the city line. So I think those things, there are opportunities and things on the horizon. And at the same time, the benefits of the infrastructure integration that in the last 5-6 years has really been happening across the region.
I mentioned the interest in certain companies to locate in certain locations, and a lot of those are oriented towards delivering us products to our homes. Again, in this kind of this new or evolving paradigm that we have here. Mike, I was interested to hear from you. You mentioned earlier the need to use existing capacity more efficiently. How is you as wizard behind the curtain handling some of these sometimes competing, or conflicting interests? And certainly, we all care about safety. Safety is number one in our planning processes. But we also have to talk about throughput and talk about freight mobility and economic the impacts to economic vitality in our.
So I touched on a little bit of this the first time I spoke, and I will come back to that. The network is, in a lot of ways, has disparate needs and it has disparate opportunities. And when we contemplate a decision like where we're going to put a development, or what kind of development we're going to put in, or how we're going to manage the transportation system around the development, we need to be aware of what those disparate issues are. And I will just be quite frank, when you force the discussion or the decision onto the highway of statewide significance, the stuff that DOT manages, those typically are the most expensive decisions you can make as a society. And it is very difficult in the current funding climate to always achieve an outcome fiscally. So you're making, I think, giving up some opportunities to look at your system and utilize the capacity you already have. So that's one thing that I think is really, really important. How we use the capacity or how we use the system, and I mentioned this earlier, has a lot to do with these trade-offs that you mentioned. For example, I mentioned if we put Matt's freight fleet on a local access road, we're likely asking for accidents and congestion. And there are decisions, policy decisions we can make together, this board can make, and we can make as local jurisdictions and state agencies that will eliminate those conflicts. And so what I always try to advocate is early planning, collaborative planning, and a lot of people at the table with you to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. My agency is pro-development. We want to see economic growth. It's part of our DNA. We also want to make sure that freight and interstate commerce is effectively getting in and out of Spokane. I mean, there are some priorities that are specifically missions of DOT, but we also live here and we also want to participate in the decision-making about how to use the system. And so that's typically how this works, in my view. The more opportunity we have really early in the process to bring people to the table to help solve those problems and understand how the system can be utilized, typically the better decision.
So we've talked about requirements and regulations and things like that. And I think the evolving landscape, if you will, from a planning perspective, is interesting. We're trying to capture those trends, if you will, or as Mr. Frank mentioned, where people want to live, where they want to recreate, and convenience and safety. Dave, do you have a good feeling on how some of those are regulations and requirements are evolving to stay in touch, I guess, with that landscape?
Well, I think I have seen, both throughout Washington and elsewhere in the US, a more sophisticated understanding of how our transportation decision-making constrains and affects the opportunities that people have in different locations, and the sort of the unintended consequences of taking a typical suburban way of thinking about transportation and land use and trying to bolt that into an urban fabric that was really pre-World War II. A big example of that is there's this powerful tendency to think about average costs, right? So how that actually works in practice is we tend to systematically overstate what it takes and what we ask infill development to mitigate, and understate the same for new greenfield development. So a perfect example of that. And we also tend to, although we not only do we require less mitigation, but we actually subsidize it, try to a large degree. Let's, for example, imagine this. You've got a house, you want to build a new house, and it's out on the urban fringe, right? And you have to use a congested freeway to get from there to where you work, right? Okay. You're now driving, you're crossing 3 jurisdictional lines, maybe you're crossing a county line, and you're using the federal aid highway, you're using the interstate highway system, right? Okay. We consider that to be a trip of regional and even national significance. You can get state and federal funding for the infrastructure necessary for that trip. Okay. If that person moves to a house that's 3 blocks from their trip, it's still a trip from their home to their office. Okay. It's the same trip, supporting the same job, has the same economic impact, but that's not a trip of state significance. That's a local problem. And if that person is walking instead of driving, it's not even on the map. It's not even on the radar. It doesn't even exist. So we tend to overcompensate for long trips and ignore short trips, okay? And so that means that our investments are really shifted away from the kind of development our comp plan says we want. Okay, another example of that, we have an impact fee system, right? Let's say we have an impact fee system, or maybe we use SEPA. We say, okay, this particular lot in South Prairie, an individual owns that lot, and they want to put in a 4-plex, let's say. Okay, 4 dwelling units. Look at our trip generation rate. Okay, 10 trips per unit. We're going to charge them per trip for that, right? That's what it's going to cost them. But because it's in an area that's relatively close, okay, we know they're going to generate a lot fewer trips necessarily. And even if they do, it's centrally located. The average trip length is significantly lower than if that was a house out on the urban fringe, okay? But we're going to charge them the same amount per trip. So again, the infill development has to pay more. Their impact is lower than average, but they're going to have to pay the average. The other trip out on the fringe, its impact is higher than average, but they're still going to have to pay the average. So again, we're sending signals to the market that says we want more of this and less of that, and as a result, we're getting more of this and less of that, and it's actually costing us more. Even if there is a need to improve a particular street, say in front of an infill development, you're talking about an improvement to an existing line that's probably 80, 90 years old at least. You probably need to repair that eventually anyway. You're not actually adding anything to your repair obligation, and yet you're still charging them the same connection fee. You're still asking them to add off-street parking in a relatively difficult lot when you probably don't need that. If you need to even be asking questions about parking at all. So these are examples of where our transportation policies, because they're adapted to sort of a one-size-fits-all pattern, aren't really very sophisticated when it comes to assessing what the real impact is. And because these were developed largely in the post-war world, post-World War II, we tend to assume that everything is going to be large lots of development, when in fact, there's a lot more opportunity opportunity out there, if we're more sophisticated about how we think about impacts.
I encourage the board, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. This panel is here for you to get more information from. So if there's any questions from the board, have any comments on what's been said so far? Have to call on somebody. Commissioner French, I can see the wheels in it.
Question.
Well, I know. Thank you. It's all real interesting. And one of the thoughts I was having as I was listening to you all talk about, how we think about the system, how we think about development, and sort of the policies, we're getting the development that we are allowing structure. Nobody's really touched on the NIMBYism conversation around people want what they want, right? And this disparity between what people want, and then when we overlay that with a large planning document or what could go in here, right? That gives people, right, their shackles go immediately. They call Mary, they call Al, they say, I don't want that there, I don't want this there, I want to have my 10 acres, and I want to drive on the interstate, and we're going to do this 200 times, and it's going to cause congestion, and that's what I want, right? How do we, I guess, as communities, have these conversations to contemplate optionality, I guess, and to Mike's point, with efficiently using the existing system first, like that's our first priority, and then we start talking about how we can sort of add on to it or better utilize local, however we design this. I guess I'm wondering where that feedback is from me, right? I'm the one who's thinking about where I want to live. Jim, I want to live in Henry Yards. I don't want to live in my suburban neighborhood anymore. I want to figure out a way to not have a car. But I still have kids at home, and they need to be close to their school, and we need to drive to soccer practice. And that is out at Liberty Lake, or it's out on the West Plains. So I'm all over the place. Right? I guess I'm just curious how we bring community and users into this conversation as well, so we can help better inform the policy decision around how do we get code that really allows for the flexibility, doesn't and say, Alan, I'm voting for you if you don't allow for me to have what I want to have, right? Because that's sort of the pressure.
I think the opportunity comes, and we're just beginning to prepare for our periodic comprehensive plan update cycle. That's where the conversation needs to happen. And if you do your comprehensive plan, not checking the boxes that are required by code, but really take it as an opportunity for integrated planning. You lay the foundation, and then that foundation should be the basis for your code. And those land use decisions should be, if you have done a good job with your comprehensive plan and developing your policies and developing your transportation plan and developing your infrastructure plans to support that. Timing may be different. You never know exactly the timing of what's going to develop where. But if we build it into the system and we set up our impact fees to address those things, then your code should not have these should be outright allowed uses, outright allowed development. If it meets the standards, it should be allowed. But that presumes that you have done a really good job on that base, which is your comprehensive plan, your strategic, your infrastructure plans, your transportation plans, et cetera.
So UCLA's done some interesting research on the relationship of NIMBYism to city councils. And councils that are largely driven by geographic districts rather than at large are more likely to have less housing developed. And so one of the challenges we have as cities is people want to make a decision on behalf of their neighborhood or their district based on their, in many cases, selfish interest, whether that's being reelected or in a neighborhood that is being in control of what development occurs. I think so there's a matter of how do you make sure that when people come to the table to talk about land uses, they're thinking about what's best for a region and the transportation impacts, land use impacts of that region, and less so about, so it's a difficult balance because GMA does talk about visions and aspirations, and breaking that into sub areas often drives people to find ways to prevent the growth from happening. And so how do you manage that at a citywide level to say, we are embracing growth in the city and this council is behind it. And so as neighborhoods, we want to hear your feedback in the context of growth is coming to your neighborhood. Let's make it great growth rather than this is a neighborhood that's going to be no growth. And I think that's, City of Spokane is particularly challenged because there are neighborhood groups. And I've attended many and they're wonderful people, but I've attended neighborhood groups over 10 years and it's the same 10 people, even though that neighborhood may have 2,000 residents that are churning and changing all the time, but there are 10 people who are defining the destiny of that neighborhood long-term.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. One of them is, I think the first thing you need to do is set aside the notion that there is one normative notion of what people want. In fact, there are, how many are there? 650,000 people in Spokane County. They all want something a little bit different. Okay, so the best way to give the people what they want is to make sure there are lots of choices. Okay, there are small apartments, there are big apartments, there are condominiums, there are single family detached homes. There's lots of different choices, so people have the ability to make trade-offs. That's one point. The other point is, as a city council person, when you're talking to individuals about what they want, an adult conversation about what you want is not about a desire, it is about trade-offs and priorities. So do you want a big house? Okay, well, that's going to mean either a bigger house on the same lot or you're going to have to pay for more land. Or do you want to be able to walk to a restaurant in your neighborhood? Is that an experience you want to be able to have in your neighborhood? Well, for that restaurant to make it, it needs, okay, this many people. Okay, that means you need to have more people in your neighborhood before that's a viable opportunity for you. Okay, there are trade-offs. Okay, that means if that restaurant is going to make it and everyone's not going to drive, it's going to need a smaller parking lot. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to walk to it. You're going to have to walk across the city parking. Okay, so these are trade-offs. Okay, so you need to have a conversation with the community, not about what they want, but about what are their priorities and what are the trade-offs associated with that. If I were to explain the planning process in 2 words, okay, those 2 words are disciplined imagination, right? You have to have a decision about what the compelling vision is, right? You want people to have the imagination about what the neighborhood can be, but that needs to be grounded in a rigorous discussion about costs, opportunities, and trade-offs.
Dave stole some of my thunder there, so thanks, Dave. So I'm just going to add a couple things that I like what you had to say there. So we find ourselves in a place though where we're not creating something, we're transforming something. And we also have a significant amount of disagreement about what success means. And I think that's a big part of the discussion. When people are concerned about what's happening, they're defining success in a certain way and failure in a certain way. I would guess most of the people in this room would say congestion is bad. Congestion is also an outcome of being very successful. And so there is a rethinking that needs to happen as we are approaching transforming what we have already built into something different. And I agree, there are a lot of opinions out there about, I hear this all the time through public feedback about what I should be building. And it's typically not the same thing when I get those phone calls. But the one thing that's certain in this is that what people want is changing. And this came up earlier, but that is clear. People are not really quite sure yet what that looks like exactly. Um, But it is changing. And so that's the really tricky part of it. I mean, it's a great question, Kelly, but that's the really tricky part of it, I think, for us. We're using old standards and old thinking related to what people have convinced themselves of what success is. And we're trying to marry that against, well, we're fighting through this issue of trying to marry that against what people are now asking of us, which is different and requires a different contemplation of what is success. And so I think a little bit of what Dave was talking about gets to that as well. Because there's a lot of opinions out there about what that really means. And so I don't think anybody has that answer yet.
Well, thank you for that. Any more questions from the board? Yeah, Paul.
Right, just an observation, these very good points, Mr. Green, and now Mike as well. One of my interests throughout the years as a municipal official has been to try to encourage more in-field development. And I certainly agree with the comment that our development standards drive development. Now, on the backside of that, a lot of those standards come from input from our citizens and from developers as well. But with regard to infill and being close to Idaho and some of the more tools I'd like for cities to have, as Idaho has Washington, our Constitution doesn't allow us to have a different connect fee for one party or another. We have to be uniform. That's another one. Idaho benefits from what's called tax financing, where they can use the future benefits of the development to buy down the taxes for the developer initially. And our Constitution in Washington is real prohibitive on that. So I've always looked for ideas on what we could do further to encourage more infill. Where I think it's going to become more and more critical as our transportation becomes more and more expensive. Even though they're narrow roads and sometimes the utilities under those roads may not have the capacity, but I still think there's huge savings. Not only doing infill, but getting rid of older structures and uses. The property in right now has been repurposed. I don't know what was before. But it's a huge improvement. As opposed to now, we had a discussion earlier meeting looking at future development. We're already out into the hinterlands around our city. What we're looking at, we're going to have to extend everything. So I'm just, if there's any thoughts on what you would see as some other tools that we could have that would help cities encourage infill in order to try to address our issues.
Well, Washington does allow tax increment financing. And we have a tax increment financing district at Kendall Yards. And at Kendall Yards, with the assistance of Spokane County and the city of Spokane, we extended that tax increment financing on Kendall Yards to the entire a big chunk of the West Central neighborhood. So it was called the West Quadrant TIF. And so that tax increment financing district that included the Kendall Yards property, which was a brownfield site, included quite a large portion of an existing neighborhood and an existing poor neighborhood that for a lot of reasons didn't get the attention to infrastructure that it should have gotten. And but that tax increment financing district, it takes time. That's the problem with tax increment financing districts, is they take time. But that district now is 10 years old and it's generating $500,000 a year in the neighborhood portion of it. And over time, probably $20 million of infrastructure is going to go into the West Central neighborhood as a result of that. So there has to be some forward thinking and there has to be some patience. The same thing at Liberty Lake. Liberty Lake had a tax increment financing district, and Liberty Lake had the benefit of, at the time, and unfortunately, the state never extended what they called the LIFT program, the local infrastructure tax program. And that allowed the cities to get a portion of the state sales tax. So it wasn't only property tax increment, it was sales tax increment. And that was a huge benefit to Liberty Lake to get that sales tax increment. So the state of Washington's also contributing. And a lot of the infrastructure that you see happening in Liberty Lake, for example, is a result of that tax increment financing district. And in Kendall Yards, the traffic light on Monroe, the construction of the Centennial Trail was a result of that, of the Kendall Yards tax increment district. The other thing, so it is a tool, and it's being used effectively in the Lake City Development Corporation in Coeur d'Alene. But you have to remember, they started that 20 years ago. So it happened, and there has to be patience for that tax increment to grow. The other program that is really an effective program in the city of Spokane is a multifamily tax credit program. So if you're doing more than 4 units, then there's a waiver of the property taxes on the new investment for a 12-year period. It's actually an 8 or 12-year period, depending on whether you incorporate some affordable units. Yeah, and it's a property tax increment. And so that's a very effective program because it has significant effect on the economics of a project. So if you have a marginal project, you can actually make it into a successful project with that increment. The other tool that I've seen used is a waiver, and this was brought up by, I think Dave, you brought this up essentially. I've seen waivers of connection fees in certain districts. So if you have an infill district that you want to encourage investment in, then there's been a waiver of the impact fees in that district. And so some of that is, the city of Liberty Lake does that. In the West Central neighborhood, for example, if you want to do infill in the West Central neighborhood, they waive the sewer and water connection fees. On traffic mitigation fees, I've seen jurisdictions use, I'll call it a micro analysis. They break down the service areas in a finer way. So it's not like one impact fee for the entire city of Cheney. It's an impact fee, and they create 5 districts within Cheney, and then have a lower fee maybe in the core area and a higher fee on the peripheral based on the infrastructure that they think is going to be necessary to develop those outlying areas may be higher, and therefore they pay a higher connection fee. I've also seen sewer and water connection fees have very often just been this flat number. So if you're building a 5,000 square foot house, you pay the $3,000 water connection fee. If you're building a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,000 square foot house, you still pay the same water connection fee. And so there has to be a little more nuance, and there can be more nuance. And in terms of how do you apply those connection fees in a more rational way, rather than one size fits all. And there are jurisdictions that have done that. For example, the Liberty Lake Sewer District gives you a 60% discount on water and sewer connection fees if your unit size is less than, I think, something like 1,000 square feet. So, and we've successfully made that argument in the city of Fairway Heights, working on an affordable housing project with Habitat in the city of Fairway Heights. And so they've acknowledged that reality, that that small home does not use what they typically identify as 1 ERU. And so they've made concessions to it. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, a lot of nuance around all of those fees that are associated with development.
We're getting close to our time limit for today. We have a SRTC board meeting following this. I do want to thank our panel for taking time out of your very busy schedules to help inform us all on these really important subjects. And I'd like to invite Lois to make a few just closing remarks today.
Thank you, Ryan. I think we obviously just scratched the surface of the linkage between transportation and land use, right? We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but maybe today you had an opportunity to get something off your chest or to hear something from some of the wonderful leaders that we have available in this community. So maybe we can just start with a round of applause and thank you for our panelists. I also want to thank those of you that joined us online remotely, as well as those of you that came out today. Some of you we've been meeting, or I've been meeting at least for the first time, and I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to come here. We are going to have about looks like maybe a 20-minute pause in between this workshop and the board meeting that'll be starting at 1 p.m. Some of our board members are going to have lunch. Certainly, if you want to stick around, you're welcome to do that. But again, the point today was to talk about the linkage between transportation and land use, and to think about that in context of the work that the SRTC organization does in this community. So again, a thanks to our panelists, a thanks to Ryan and the SRTC staff for putting this together today. And we'll also be looking for some feedback. This is the first workshop that we've done, but it probably will not be the last workshop that we'll do. So again, we'll look for some feedback from those of you that have attended. So again, thank you so much for today, and come back to our workshop next month. Thank you.
I don't think so.